Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with robot enthusiasts from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, how can we promote diversity in robotics? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone! Welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and this week's episode covers two interesting and important topics. How we can centre humans in the robot design process, and how we can promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in robotics. But first, I'd like to remind you about our live event this summer. I'll be at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London on Sunday the 16th of June, chatting to three amazing panellists about robotic prosthetics and human augmentation as part of the Great Exhibition Road Festival. This is your chance to join the Robot Talk audience and ask your questions to our panellists live. So make sure you register for a free ticket to guarantee yourself a spot. I've popped the ticket link in the episode description. So, with all that said, let's get on with this week's interview. I recently had a really interesting conversation with Isabelle Ormerod from the University of Bristol, all about human-centred design and women in robotics. This week, I'm chatting to Isabelle Ormerod, a PhD student at the University of Bristol, whose work focuses on using wearable technologies, mixed reality, and camera tracking to enrich industrial practice. Hi, Isabelle. Great to have you on Robot Talk.
Hi, Claire. Thanks for having me.
So your PhD is applying data-driven techniques to human factors and human-centred design. So for listeners who aren't familiar, can you explain what we mean by human factors?
So if you were to look up a definition of human factors engineering, you'd see it's about the application of psychological and physiological principles to the engineering and design of products, processes, and systems. This is pretty broad. You can think of this even in designing the new interface in an app, designing a new piece of robotic surgical equipment, or even designing a toothbrush, integrating how user groups we're designing for are likely to use something or incorrectly use something is critical for user safety or the level of performance someone can perform a task with using this equipment. It's not just about looking at the complexity of a task, it's looking at the user groups that we're designing for, their abilities, and the environment that we're actually performing that task in. So the kind of examples that I tend to draw on are things like medical equipment. Say you're designing something like an injection device, it's very different a trained healthcare professional carrying out a task compared to an older person who maybe has limited dexterity or potential cognitive difficulties. Another example might be working with equipment in and outside of like a high stakes environment. So again, using robotic equipment inside an operating theatre with lots of people observing you is very different to practicing using equipment at home. So human factors, even though it's a very broad, all-encompassing term, is integral to fields like assistive robotics and human-robot interaction.
Yeah, and the immediate thing that springs to my mind is the importance of diversity in that, right? Like I know that classically an awful lot of products have been designed to fit men better than women, and presumably that's because they're not getting women into their groups that test these things or not considering different groups of people when they're designing these products.
Yeah, that's completely true. I think there's kind of a history of the team that you're working with potentially not representing all these different user variations. And that's something that in industry they do quite a lot of, is kind of looking at experienced users or non-experienced users or people with like different degrees of cognitive challenges or dexterity challenges. And it's quite important so that you can fully kind of look at every eventuality. But in human-centered design, which is kind of what I refer to designing things with people in mind, it's quite difficult to do that fully. And kind of the ways that people might interact with something that you're working with every day as an engineer is often completely unexpected. And you often will find people making mistakes that you wouldn't even thought were possible. So it's quite difficult to completely capture all of that information, and you have to take a very different approach compared to the classic design approach that many of us are familiar with.
Yeah. So how do you approach this kind of area of study?
So I guess I'll kind of go through the design processes a lot of us will be familiar with, or at least
Mm.
I'm familiar with. Often when you start of trying to solve a problem, you sit down and you think, oh, what are all the different things I need to be thinking of? What are my key stakeholders here? And you might go away and do some brainstorming. You'll come up with some concept designs. You might begin to prototype some of these so you can visualize what's going on.
Mhm.
And then you will weigh up the positives and negatives before going in and building more complex designs that will take more time, like to get through lots of different design iterations and ultimately build the best thing.
Mm.
You've got to create low fidelity ways of communicating your ideas so you can make those decisions quite quickly.
Right.
Um, but I think in integrating human-centered design, the approach is quite qualitative. So what you normally start with is ethnographic research. So looking at the user groups that you're actually building for, what are their abilities, what are the likely pitfalls, looking at similar products that have been made before,
Mm.
and also, sitting down with in focus groups. So maybe talking to healthcare professionals that have been involved in the process, that have used things, sitting down with patients, sitting down with people that have used similar things before. And you can do things like a cognitive walkthrough. So that would be asking a professional to maybe talk through all the different things that are going on in their head while they're trying out a
Mm.
prototype. And you can imagine that, yes, this approach is very holistic, and it means that you can capture a lot of information from people that will be using it. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it's actually very time consuming,
Yeah.
and making sure that you can do it in a way that isn't going to be able to kind of completely slow down these things that we're familiar with, like prototyping and making sure that we can make those decisions quickly. It kind of means that you kind of end up with this bottleneck sometimes in
Yeah.
incorporating human-centered approaches, and it means sometimes you don't actually end up doing it very well. There are other ways to do this that are more quantitative. So in health and safety, for example, often
Mm.
there'll be like you're probably familiar with these kind of checkbox time kind of
Yeah.
exercises, like rate your desk setup on a scale of 1 to 5,
Yeah.
which is good in some circumstances, but it also removes the kind of richness of that data capture.
Mm.
And there are some cases where that's really not going to be applicable. So, for example, yeah, when you're designing medical equipment, or you're designing something that needs like a very high level of dextrous skill, or
Yeah.
even maybe when you're designing sports equipment, so something that is completely personalized for an individual,
Mm.
actually you really want a really rich data capture there, which means human-centered design needs to be very qualitative and ultimately time consuming. So it's a bit of a double edged sword. Do you want qualitative and really rich data capture, or do you want quantitative and potentially less fidelity of results?
Yeah. And I guess as well, like the richer kind of qualitative data that you're collecting, because that's so time consuming, that probably limits the number of different people that you can collect that from. But then you also want to be able to pick up on those individual differences and not just kind of rely on like one or two people to represent an entire group.
Yeah, completely, completely. It's quite a challenging thing of how do we get results that are, quick and full of information that we can then use, and take forward, and then apply those changes to our designs without kind of compromising on the whole thing.
Mm. And I guess as well, like with something like robotics, it's not necessarily always that easy to make like a quick, simple prototype and to keep iterating this process because these are complex and expensive machines, right?
Yeah, I think in robotics in particular, human factors actually is beginning to look quite different. We have such an interdisciplinary field of
Mm.
mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, machine learning engineers, psychologists. So there's a lot of expertise. But again, like, yeah, it's quite easy to create really bespoke methods to define a small problem, and then ultimately it's quite difficult to then know what to do with that information. So my
Mm.
PhD is kind of looking at, okay, well, there are actually lots of different methods that are available that are open source or have been used a lot for kind of like simple data capture, but actually how are we going to use that in tandem with qualitative results and other types of sensing to build a more holistic picture of what is actually going on in a product interaction. So it's not just about, okay, well, you can see that in this circumstance, maybe someone is undergoing more fatigue or less fatigue. It's
Mm.
also, how am I actually going to change what I'm doing to reduce this issue.
Yeah.
And it's not just to do with fatigue. Say, for example, there are some user steps or something that someone has to do that cause greater cognitive load. So now I'm looking at maybe using a piece of equipment like eye tracking or FNIRS, which is functional near infrared spectroscopy. There's a couple of people in the Design and Manufacturing Futures group at Bristol that do a lot of work with looking at the differences in design and what effect this has on people's cognitive load. And using that kind of holistically to create a picture of, okay, well, now we need to try and like make a change and communicate that back to users so that we can then kind of have that quick prototyping, low fidelity solution of trying to increase that number of design iterations that we're doing. So like you said at the beginning, there's a lot of mixed reality that goes on in the kind of region I work in. So say I'm working with users and I'm finding that there's a certain design that I want to change. Maybe I could use something like a mixed reality headset and have like a block object, something like that, and change the way that it looks in mixed reality so that I can get really quick feedback from users while they're in the room. And I can go back and make lots of design iterations, making sure that it's human-centered each time.
That's cool.
Yeah, it would be really cool. It's kind of like at the start of trying to kind of apply this kind of proactive approach to design and getting users in the room and applying these changes as and when they come. But I think that, yeah, a big thing that we're kind of keen to look at is not just having it for surface level insights and kind of proactively changing the design.
Yeah. And I mean, I know you've mentioned kind of medical robotics and also like industry. Does the process change a lot between those different fields? Or is it just different users, but the same basic kind of process of prototyping, feedback, and iterating on that?
Well, I guess that's kind of the challenge in itself. It's finding the opportunities where this kind of technique will work. I think, I've been saying about the potential negatives of the current techniques, qualitative and the quantitative techniques that exist. There are inevitably going to be some cases where qualitative data capture is going to be far more likely and useful for the individuals working to design these things.
Yeah.
So, it's very difficult to capture how something looks or feels, for example. So using quantitative data capture in like, commercial product design, for example, maybe wouldn't be a great use case, but actually using it in a medical setting or a sports performance setting would be far more useful. And it's also about the people that are designing. So like I've said, roboticists are ideal candidates because we've got such an interdisciplinary area, but human factors engineers typically are people with a psychology background that actually maybe don't have that much knowledge about how to implement machine learning, and therefore it might actually not be the most useful tool for those people in that setting.
Yeah. Fascinating. Very, very complicated. I can see why there's at least one PhD in this, probably many more. So you're part of the leadership team of Women in Robotics UK. Can you tell us a little bit about the organisation and the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, of course, of course. So our kind of mission statement for Women in Robotics UK is we are a safe and empowering community of people who identify as women, non-binary, transgender, and those allied in supporting and promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion within robotics. We work across industry, academia, and the arts to provide engaging and inclusive events, mentoring, networking, and collaboration opportunities around the UK. Over the last year, we've been lucky enough to run events across the country, that being in Edinburgh, London, Bristol, Cambridge, and Oxford. We've been working with UK RAS, the National Robotarium, and RS Grassroots to supply these events. It's been an absolute whirlwind, but yeah, it's been such an invaluable experience being part of the leadership team and meeting some of the amazing women and allies at the events that we are currently running. We've kind of been really conscious to make sure that all the events that we run kind of give something back to people that come to the events. We want it to be like a useful professional experience for the people that come along, and ultimately everyone else on the leadership team. Quick shout out to Ella Moore, Yara Zakaria, and Edith Clare Hall, who run Women in Robotics with me. I think for us it's been a really important professional development experience as well. So we want to make sure that we're able to enrich our careers also by doing this. I guess to talk about a couple of the events that we've been running throughout the years, we've run a couple versions of our Headshots and Bots event. And my colleague Edith kind of came up with this idea after I think we were trying to find some fun photos online of like women with robotics or women in robotics
Mm.
for our kind of promotional activities. And basically every single photo that we found was kind of like women kind of either as some kind of sexy robot or a man with some kind of sexy female robot. And we
Yeah.
were like, this is actually crazy because there are so many amazing women that work in robotics.
Yeah.
And we need to create opportunities so that we're able to have more professional photos of women working in robotics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we ran an event both in Bristol and then another one in Edinburgh, kind of as like a headshot opportunity for women to get photos with their bots.
Nice.
And it meant that we could get some really nice photos of us all working all together. And that's been a really, really great event that we've really enjoyed running. Another event that we did recently was a career mapping workshop.
Okay.
This was also in Bristol. So we had a really great panel of women talking about their experiences working in robotics, kind of at all different stages of their career. Um, and then what we wanted to do was try and map out kind of those key career decision points that helped them kind of figure out where they should turn point in their career and when they were going to be changing and why they made those decisions. So those decisions were either kind of like, I wanted to change into this job because they had really great support or really diverse workplace, or the career move was just the right development for me. And I guess the idea would be trying to figure out what are those things that kind of keep women working in STEM, and what are the kind of things that maybe promote women to lead out of a career in STEM, and try and gather that insight so then we could have like this kind of best practice go-to thing from our events. I think another thing that I want to talk about, which is really exciting for us, is we back in September applied for the Ingenious Award with the Royal Academy of Engineering for a program called Launchbox, which I'll talk a little bit more in a sec. We've been awarded the grant, and over the next year, we're going to be running a outreach program across the country, which is really exciting.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. I think one thing that we're all very conscious of is at a young age, there's not really enough access to outreach and STEM subjects and STEM role models at a young age. I know, at least from my experience, I didn't even think about doing engineering until about the age of 16 because I just didn't really know what it was. It wasn't the thing that was really talked about.
Yeah, definitely.
So we'll be running a STEM program for women and non-binary pupils from ages 13 to 17 to try and kind of get some more interest in robotics and learn that it's not a scary word and that we want more women working in this field. So hopefully, once that's all released, we can talk a little bit more about it. But that's the basic premise at the moment.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Very exciting. So yeah, this all kind of links into the last question that I had that I wanted to talk to you about, which was kind of the barriers that you think discourage women and non-binary people from entering robotics, and also, the things that potentially prevent them from staying in the field. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question that is different for everyone. I think there's going to be many different reasons that some people will have experienced and some people won't have. And anything that I say now, I'm not saying is a overarching experience of women working within robotics. I'm still here. The rest of the leadership team is still here. You are still here. But I think there are some facts that we can't really dispute. And I think there's a stat that is, the average time that a woman stays in the STEM field is about 7 years after professional qualification, which, when you think about it, is not a very long time. And there's a lot to suggest that the kind of roles that you take on in the office kind of mean that you have a reduced access to the social and decision-making network within companies or research. Also, I saw a paper recently, which was in 2017, some of the largest funding bodies for STEM research in the UK, fewer than 7% of all research grants were awarded to teams led by women.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And on average, grants awarded to women were less than 40% of the sums received by their male colleagues, which, this is still happening. I guess this was maybe 7 years ago, but, these things are undisputed.
Yeah.
There's still a gender pay gap. These are all things that actually, when you stack them all on top of each other, it's going to probably have some effect. I think, going back to the fact that, everyone's experience will be different. One of the things that when robotics wanted to do was kind of capture the general consensus or promote some difficult conversations around this particular subject. I think we're very keen as a group to encourage men to come to our events. We think that uncomfortable conversations are good. If you're always comfortable, then you're never learning,
Yeah.
I think. So we really want people to come along, not be afraid to ask controversial questions. And this was something that we wanted to do with our EDI roundtable. For those that don't know, EDI is kind of an acronym for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we kind of wanted to ask some more controversial questions that kind of tackle this topic. Those questions kind of looked at historically marginalized groups are often overstretched to represent equity, diversity, and inclusion in robotics.
Yeah.
How can we actually go about mitigating this? How can we support women or transgender or women of color in robotics to kind of be able to do their roles, but then also kind of be beacons in robotics of equity, diversity, and inclusion? We looked at things like hiring quotas. Do we think they're a necessary or fair tool to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in robotics? And also just asking the people that came to our events, what does community look like to you? How do you find that kind of social network that is so important in your job? And what other groups should we collaborate with so that we can kind of keep this going across the country? And I think the kind of key themes that came out of that were things like easier access to EDI training, understanding that should be going on at the start of a job throughout your job. I think also including things like outreach and EDI as integral job responsibilities that are important for you to be promoted within an organization, and advocating for discussions that include everyone in robotics. And that's what I mean by kind of making sure that, these events aren't just for women. We want to make sure that everyone is included in the conversation. The topic of hiring quotas is still a pretty divisive topic, but it was really great to kind of see some kind of more, not heated discussion, but see some discussion of actually just talking about it, because we never talk about it. We're never going to be able to come up with any kind of potential solutions. And I think, I want to kind of reiterate that there are undisputed advantages to having a diverse workplace. Especially in such an interdisciplinary field like robotics. It's so important to have different viewpoints and increase the types of collaboration and different learning. One of the things I often say is I didn't quite know what an engineering job involved until I was about 16, but my mum, she was a fashion designer. I grew up making clothes throughout my youth, and actually so much of that is to do with fabrication that was like instantly applicable to the field. And when I entered the workplace and entered my PhD, I had a completely different viewpoint of how to make things compared to the people around me, which ultimately just enriched the quality of things that you are able to do. And people need to kind of think of engineering in a less traditional, you don't just have to be fixing bikes at home with your parents. It can look like many, many different things that lots of people have experienced, and everyone belongs in engineering.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've been amazed from all the interviews I've done for Robot Talk at just how much diversity in terms of the roles that you can do in robotics and what the day-to-day of it is just unbelievably kind of varied. So yeah, it's definitely not, like you said, that stereotype that a lot of people have of what, the physical engineering of tinkering with things and taking them apart. It can be so much more than that.
Yeah, completely. I think, as you've said, working in such an interdisciplinary field, you work with people with so many different walks of life. And it's so important to the kind of fruition of robotics and the direction that we're all moving in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are incredibly important issues. I'm really glad that Women in Robotics UK is doing this great work. Obviously, I appreciate that all of the leadership team are also very busy doing PhDs, doing jobs. And so I'm very impressed that you also have found the time to do all of this extra work. I guess it kind of a little bit comes back to what you were saying about the pressure being on people to be representatives and to, having to spend that time. It's a worthy activity, but it also is not for free, right? It takes up a huge amount of your time and energy.
I think so. And I think people forget that actually, doing this work, as much as it's so important for all of us, it means that there's going to be a small fraction of our time that is not spent on doing our research and being paid for this kind of work, and not just being expected to be a martyr for a cause is I think, really important and shouldn't be taken for granted. And that's why having outreach and EDI as part of like paid job responsibilities is really important to keeping women working in this field.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. Isabelle, it's been lovely talking to you today. I've been speaking to Isabelle Ormerod, a PhD student at the University of Bristol. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, please do share the podcast, subscribe, and leave a review to let us know what you think. Next week, I'm speaking to Lord Ara Darzi from Imperial College London, all about robotic surgery, past, present, and future. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk is brought to you by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.